So as I mentioned, we want to look at two other anxiety disorders. First is OCD, and then the second one is PTSD. And both of these have been really reduced down to their designations. But Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder, which is really what OCD is. And you hear people, interestingly enough, in our everyday parlance, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And we can take those apart in a minute just to describe it. But you can hear people say, well, I'm really compulsive about this or another thing, or I'm obsessing about something in particular. And this disorder itself is characterized by unwanted repetitive thoughts. Repetitive thoughts, and that's what we refer to as obsessiveness or obsessions. And they ruminate over these. That's another word that oftentimes is used within this, is rumination or perseveration. They ruminate. That word comes from actually cattle. They have a number of stomachs, and in that stomach, each of those stomachs, they have a bacteria called rumen. So when you see a cow chewing its cud, oftentimes what we refer to is that's ruminating. They bring up the contents of their stomach and then chew on it again, and that's where we get this word ruminate or perseverate. And what that simply means is going over something over and over and over again. Perseverating on a particular thought. So it's the repetitive nature of these thoughts that we're talking about. The second part is unwanted or repetitive actions. So repetitive actions, or what might be called rituals. And that's what we refer to as compulsions. The thing to keep in mind, and why we connect this with anxiety, is that these two things are moves on the person's part to bind the anxiety. So whether it's the going over something in your mind over and over again, or whether it's engaging in some compulsive behavior, like checking behaviors, checking doorknobs, checking lights, checking those sorts of things. They are all about allaying anxiety. So if you remember when we were talking about earlier about anxiety disorders, where an anxiety disorder is defined not only by the anxiety, the persistent anxiety, but also dysfunctional anxiety reducing behaviors. Well, OCD is a good example of that. The obsessions may be concerned with dirt or germs or toxins. The compulsions may have something to do with hand washing or checking doors, locks, appliances, and essentially they become so pervasive that they take over much of the person's thought life, if you will. Take over thought life. So they're spending all of their time on these particular obsessions and nothing else. And they may have the obsession of somebody having it out for them, or persecutory kinds of things. So OCD, when somebody says I'm so OCD, in a non-clinical sense, that may mean that they do something to the nth degree. They may be really, really detailed, but it doesn't rise to the level of what we're talking about here. Now, that does not mean that you can't have some of these characteristics. For example, when I'm working on a web project or I'm working on a project, I can be very, very detailed and OCD, quote unquote, with it, because I get all caught up in minor details that nobody would ever notice. But I notice because of the standards that I keep for myself. And that's a good example of really commonplace OCD, a common person's OCD. It's not disruptive to my life. I don't miss deadlines. I stop at some point in time. Now, there are some students that sometimes the only way that they can get something done is the pressure of having to get it done rather than doing it on a timed schedule. And that has characteristics of that, and that's part of the backdrop. Now, the other thing that is other anxiety disorder, which is quite prevalent, is referred to as PTSD, and it's been a lot in the news, frequently heard in the news these days. It's even come up in the presidential debate in terms of veterans. They're coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq with PTSD, which is characterized by haunting memories. I had one former student who had spent some time in Kuwait and went through a firefight, and it was a haunting memory to her. It kept her awake at night. Loud noises. The 4th of July is probably the worst time of year for some veterans because of the sounds of fireworks. Nightmares is another one that they experience, a reliving of what they've been through in their nighttime. Another one is social withdrawal. A lot of times with this comes substance abuse. Another aspect is intrusive memories that is also part of this. Now, this is one area that I'm spending all of my time talking about, for the most part, in crisis and trauma. We talk about PTSD on a regular basis. Insomnia is another one that somebody will have as a result. And so you can have people, GIs tend to be identified with PTSD, but women who have been sexually assaulted or sexual abuse victims all have these same characteristics that come into play when it comes to trying to treat it and so forth. So combat veterans, accident, disaster survivors, we will probably be hearing tales from Hurricane Sandy. Certainly we have it from Katrina. Like I mentioned, assault victims and trauma victims, school shootings, the Aurora shooting, for example. People that are coming out of that will certainly probably be having symptoms of PTSD. So each of these are good examples where that happens. And the key to keep in mind is really only, I shouldn't say only, but about half of people that go through these trauma experiences experience PTSD symptoms. And that's something to keep in mind, is that it's not a dead ringer that somebody goes through trauma and they're going to be PTSD. That's not necessarily the case. Actually, the numbers are about 1 in 10 women and 1 in 20 men develop PTSD symptoms. So 1 in 10 women and 1 in 20 men develop these symptoms. So when you think about it, what you will realize is that those numbers are not huge. That's 5 in 100. That's about 5% of men, and 1 in 10, which is about 10% of women. So it's huge to the person experiencing it. I'm certainly not diminishing the impact it has on them. But at the same time, because of media exposure, we end up getting the impression that everybody in the military is experiencing PTSD, and that really isn't the case. And we have to take that into account when we're talking about this particular nature of this disorder specifically. So, all right, let's finish up with looking at and understanding anxiety disorders to finish up this particular module.